Okay, I should be on. Do you getting anything there? Yeah, you are. All right, good. Well, should we get started? Okay, just invite everybody to go ahead and get a snack and take your seat. We're about to get started here. And thanks everyone for coming. I think we've got a great program tonight, and I think you'll be very happy that you're here to hear our speaker. So I want to start with our normal agenda. We'll do an opening prayer, and I've asked Pastor Milius to do the opening prayer. I'll introduce the speaker, and after his talk, we'll do a question-answer period. Then we'll do a few announcements, and we'll close with the Lord's Prayer and the hymn, I Sing the Mighty Power of God. So that's our agenda for the evening. Pastor.
Shall we pray? In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Oh God, our Heavenly Father, after having created this world as you did in its majesty by your own power and by your word, you, after it had been destroyed by sin, saw fit even to redeem this very creation in which you relish and which you value very deeply, by sending your own Son to Bethlehem, that he would come and redeem us and thereby redeem the entire creation. For this we give you thanks and honor, praise and glory, and we therefore this night gather to give our attention to at least part of your creation and the consideration of that creation that you have made, that you have redeemed, and that you will perfect in the new world. We ask therefore that you would give us clarity to learn this night from Nate and the things that he brings to us. We ask these things through your Son and our Lord Jesus Christ.
Amen. Thank you. Okay, our guest speaker tonight is Mr. Nate Loper, who is the executive director from Canyon Ministries. Canyon Ministries does tours and raft trips and just all kinds of education on the Grand Canyon. And they've been doing that for over 25 years. Nate has personally spent over 800 days teaching at the Grand Canyon on various trips and rim tours, and I'm going to let him tell you more about that. He also has 20 years experience in giving tours around national parks and museums, and he stayed with us last night. We had an opportunity to get to know him. He's well versed in all the areas of creation, so get your questions ready. And he's also doing some research in the areas of geology and biblical archaeology, so maybe he'll tell us a little bit about that too. His topic for tonight is Grand Canyon, a flood of evidence. So let's welcome Nate Loper.
All right, thank you, Judy. And welcome everybody here in Denver, the great state of Colorado, which is my home state, actually, so it's good to be back home for a little bit. I do live in Arizona now, Flagstaff, Arizona, where, of course, the Grand Canyon is at. Now, how many of you guys have been to the Grand Canyon before? Let's see. All right, most of you guys, very good. How many of you have been on a river trip through the Grand Canyon? Ed, raise your hand. All right, very good. So that means there's a whole bunch of y'all who need to come out and see us, right? So it's absolutely a pleasure to be here with you guys and to be able to share a little bit about one of my favorite places on the planet, which of course is the Grand Canyon. And so I get the amazing privilege of having the absolute best job in the world. Now you might like what you do, but I think I've got the best job in the world because I get to go and see the Grand Canyon all the time, and I get to see it with a whole bunch of other people from around the world and be able to share and to teach and to talk about that from a biblical creation perspective. So of course, in doing that, we see amazing sights from the top to the bottom and everywhere in between. And so like Judy said, yeah, Canyon Ministries has been in existence for about 25 years now. This is actually our 25-year anniversary this year. So we're celebrating this year 25 years of Grand Canyon creation ministry. And over those years, we have served thousands and thousands of people at the Grand Canyon on rafting trips and daily rim tours along the South Rim, of hiking tours and backpacking trips and all kinds of stuff. So we really showcase the Grand Canyon from a biblical creation perspective perspective. And it's amazing that we can do these wild adventures in an amazing place like this and be able to take thousands of people every single year on trips and tours. Right now, we're serving about 3,000 people a year that come through our ministry at the Grand Canyon itself, and so it is phenomenal. We do tours every single day, except for Sundays out there, that we offer different tours, and so lots of different ways to see and experience the Grand Canyon, of course, and so we get this opportunity to see, to study, to experience the Grand Canyon from an amazing perspective. So tonight, I'm going to kind of dive in and talk to you guys a little bit about what we like to do there, and especially a lot about what it means to be at the Grand Canyon. And so, of course, why the Grand Canyon? Why do we go to a place like this? What is the significance of the Grand Canyon? And I think President Teddy Roosevelt may have said it best. He said, "In the Grand Canyon, Arizona has a natural wonder, which is in kind absolutely unparalleled throughout the rest of the world." And for those of you who have been to the Grand Canyon, I think you would agree, this place is pretty spectacular, right? There's really no place like the Grand Canyon on the face of the earth. It's incredible. So tonight I'm going to talk a little bit about the Grand Canyon, show you guys a little bit about what we have, and then teach a little bit about why we have it and some of the significance of it. But looking around the room tonight, we've got mixed ages. We've got some older ones, we've got some younger ones. So I'm going to kind of keep the teaching to two different levels, right? That way we're able to have a lot of fun, but also able to learn a lot of stuff too. So we're going to have a great time diving into the Grand Canyon and studying a little bit about what it is. So if you've never been to the Grand Canyon, never seen the place, let me kind of show you a little bit about what we have there. The Grand Canyon, as you see here, starts way up top on the right-hand side, just below Lake Powell. About 15 miles below Lake Powell, we get to be the Grand Canyon. And going 277 river miles, we end up at Lake Mead on the far western side. So Lake Powell up here, made by the Glen Canyon Dam back in 1963. And then you go all the way to Lake Mead on the far western side, made by the Hoover Dam back in 1935. And that's over there by Las Vegas. So in between these two big man-made lakes of Lake Powell and Lake Mead, we have the entirety of the Grand Canyon in the great state of Arizona. And it's, like I said, 277 miles long. The Grand Canyon, on average, is 10 miles wide from side to side on average. And it's over a mile deep in most places. So 277 miles long, 10 to 18 miles wide, over a mile deep. Some have said making this one of the largest canyons on the face of the earth by total volume. It is so big, in fact, that you can see the Grand Canyon from outer space, they say. And standing on the moon, I've heard, you can actually see the Grand Canyon from the moon. And in pictures from the Apollo astronauts in the 1960s and early 70s, they say in some of those pictures you can actually see the Grand Canyon. Pretty incredible. Now, if you've never been to the Grand Canyon, come on out. You're missing a whole lot. And if you have been there, of course, you know what a spectacular place it really is. And so, of course, when people come to look at the Grand Canyon, what are they really actually looking at? A bunch of rocks, right? And you go to the Grand Canyon, that's the obvious feature. We have thousands of feet of water-laid sedimentary rocks that we can see at the Grand Canyon. Rock layers like sandstone and limestone and shale, those are the predominant rock types we have at the Grand Canyon. So way up top here we have the Kaibab limestone, that's kind of the rim rock of the Grand Canyon. And you work your way down through layers of sandstone, limestone, shale, until you get down to this layer of rock called the Tapeats sandstone. That's a big sandstone layer. And if you look from the Kaibab down to the Tapeats, these rock layers are all kind of going flat and horizontal. Then below the Tapeats, you have some tilted, angled rock layers we call the Grand Canyon supergroup, and those work their way down until you get to that Bass limestone down below. And then underneath that, you get into metamorphic and igneous rocks. And those are kind of the basement rocks of the Grand Canyon way down there. Those are the bottom features of the canyon. In fact, they are the basement rocks we see around the whole world. Pretty much, if you were to drill down deeper, that's pretty much all you're going to encounter down to the melting of the mantle of the earth, combinations of igneous and metamorphic rocks. So you work your way down to the basement of the Grand Canyon, and you end up with different rock types than you see on top of there. But to kind of give you perspective, we have all three major rock types represented. So if you remember from school in geology, all rocks around the world fall into one of three different classifications. We have sedimentary rock, right, which are rocks that are typically laid down by water. You can oftentimes think of them like glued together sand grains. And then we have metamorphic rocks, rocks that have undergone a change by heat and pressure oftentimes. And then we have igneous rocks, rocks that come up from lavas and volcanoes. You can think of them like magma that rose up and then spilled over the surface or came through in various dikes and sills and things that became these solidified rocks. And so even at the Grand Canyon, especially the western end of the Grand Canyon, we have volcanoes and volcanic lava flows, in some cases where lava's come over the rim and spilled its way even all the way down to the river. And so you can kind of see that black ribbon. That's what that represents. But this is just a very quick, very basic snapshot of Grand Canyon geology. I'll refer to this a few times tonight. But tonight, as I'm talking with you guys, this is about an hour-long presentation. Now, our shortest tour at the Grand Canyon is 4 hours long. So as you can imagine, I'm not going to be able to cover everything of the Grand Canyon in only 1 hour. In fact, even on a 4-hour rim tour, we can't cover everything about the Grand Canyon. Even on a 9-day river trip, we still can't cover everything about the Grand Canyon. As Ed knows, there's a lifetime of learning that you can see there, right? And so our river trips are 4, 7, and 9 days in length, and even on a 9-day river trip, there's still things left to be discussed and to be discovered there. But tonight I'm going to kind of give you a snapshot of my favorite thing of the Grand Canyon. If somebody were to ask me, Nate, what is your number one thing that you would point to as evidence for a global flood? This is what I want to share with you guys tonight. Basically 3 rock-solid evidence for a global flood as seen at the Grand Canyon, and going to kind of dive into one little area in particular. So, I know I talk kind of quickly. You can watch the video afterwards if you need to go back and refresher. But we'll try to cram in a lot tonight. So we look here, we can see the layers of the Grand Canyon as we talked about, and the area that I really want to focus on tonight, the one key feature, is right here where we see this Tapeats sandstone. Can everybody tonight say Tapeats? All right, very good. So the Tapeats sandstone is a fantastic layer, and we're going to talk about a few features actually, that we can see and gain and understand from that Tapeats sandstone. One of the first things I'm going to talk about tonight, the first of these rock-solid evidences, is what we call great unconformity. Now, don't worry, guys. That's one of the biggest words I'm going to teach you tonight. Don't worry. But the great unconformity that we see here represents a tremendous amount of erosion. So oftentimes geologists look at unconformities as tremendous amounts of missing time. Because when you see an unconformity, the rocks don't conform. They don't match up. So we have things like angular unconformities. We have time gaps that we would see sometimes. Basically, an unconformity represents a change within the rock, a change within the sequence. Now, when we look at the Grand Canyon, the great unconformity looks like what you would see here. This tilted, angled rocks down below, the Grand Canyon supergroup, when they come up and when they meet that Tapeats sandstone, the contact point where they meet, where they come together, that contact point is the great unconformity. It's not a layer, it's a section of missing rock, you might say. Now, looking at this, these tilted, angled rocks down below should continue rising on up, right? If they're tilted up, they should continue going up. But something has happened to shear them off straight across and then stack up about 4,000 feet of water-laid sedimentary rock on top of there. Some major erosional event has scoured the landscape, cutting them off and then stacking up a bunch of sediment on top of there. Some major water erosion event. What might that be? What could we possibly be talking about? Do we have any evidence or any clue or any indication of a worldwide water event? Really big erosional event? Yeah, we kind of do. The Bible, there's a book, it talks about it. Genesis 6, 7, and 8 describes this flood event as a worldwide catastrophe. And so we're going to talk about that tonight. We see right here this great unconformity, a bunch of erosion. So let's talk a little bit about it. The great unconformity is seen from Lippen Point, my favorite overlook of the rim. You can see in this picture, tilted, angled rocks. You see where the river's at? Work your way up, kind of in the background here. Tilted, slanted rocks right through here until you get to the Tapeats sandstone right there. And that goes flat and horizontal. You can see the tilted, angled rocks down below coming in contact with the flat, horizontal rocks, and from then on up, flat, horizontal rocks. Where the tilted rocks meet the flat rocks, that is the great unconformity. Now, this is from Lippen Point, a picture I took about 6, 7 years ago. But down on the river, here's another picture I took. A place called Blacktail Canyon, where we get the opportunity to get up close and personal with this great unconformity. Looking at this picture, it's easy to see the difference in the rocks, right? Look at these rocks down below. They're almost looks vertical, in fact. They're tilted, but they almost look vertical, and then horizontal rocks on top of there. Now, the great unconformity is the gap, the space, you might say, this section between the tilted rocks below and the flat-lying Tapete sandstone on top of there, representing a tremendous amount of erosion. Now, some geologists would look at that and they would say this great unconformity not only represents a tremendous amount of erosion, but it also represents a tremendous amount of time, tremendous amount of missing time, in fact. In fact, most geologists would say that between the crystalline basement rocks you see here at the very bottom and the Tapete sandstone, they would say we're missing upwards of 1.2 billion years of geological time. Now, I didn't say million, but billion. They would say 1.2 billion years of Earth's geological past has gone missing between when these rocks were formed, right down here, and when these rocks were deposited on top. That's a long, long time. Not a million, but a billion years of missing time. Now, one of the reasons they call for that is the tremendous amount of material that's missing, the tremendous amount of erosion that's happened. And that, of course, is using naturalistic processes, the idea of what we call uniformitarianism. Now, slow, gradual, uniform processes, they would say, given enough time, would add up to big features. So the concept or the idea of uniformitarianism, it's a way of thinking by looking at the world we have today and assuming, making an assumption, that the world we have today, the present processes today, are the same way that everything's been happening since the very beginning of time. So if you observe today slow, gradual processes, for example, if you observe that a canyon is getting 1 inch deep every single year, well, how many years do you need to add up to get a big Grand Canyon, for example? And so they would assume by today's present processes, they would say that the present is the key to the past. I'm sure some of you guys have heard that before, right? That was a phrase coined by a lawyer turned geologist named Charles Lyell, and back in the 1830s he wrote a series of books called The Principles of Geology. And Charles Lyell would argue that the present is the key to the past. In other words, if you want to understand Earth's ancient past, well, just look at today's present processes, today's present rates, and naturally you would assume everything's been happening like that since the beginning of time. But as someone who believes in God's Word, the Bible, to be true, I would say it's the exact opposite that's the case. It's not the present world we live in today that's the key to understanding the past. Rather, I believe it's the past and the events of the past that are the key to the present world we have today, right? If you want to understand why we have the world we have today and how we got here, you need to understand what has happened in the past. And since you and I were not here necessarily since the very beginning in the past, we need to rely upon another source of authority, right? Another eyewitness, if you will. Fortunately, we are given God's Word, the Bible, as a key source to some of those events that have happened in the past. Of course, the Bible doesn't talk about everything that's happened in history, nor everything that's happened in science, but the Bible does touch on areas of history and of science, and where it talks about those things, we can believe those areas to be just as true and real and applicable of anything of any spiritual nature, you might say. So we look at this and we can see that, yes, the world we have around us, we see it through the biblical lens of Scripture, makes a lot more sense, I would say. And so we look at things like this great unconformity. Are we missing a tremendous amount of rock because of a tremendous amount of time and slow, gradual erosional processes? Or could we perhaps be missing a tremendous amount of rock from a tremendous event? Well, to understand that, we need to go and examine the rocks, right? And speak to the rocks, and they will tell you what has happened in the past. We go and examine these rocks, we go and take a look at what they say, and guess what? The rocks cry out. They speak as a testimony of God's Word being true, and we can see it for ourselves in the very rocks. So, for example, Blacktail Canyon, looking right here, this is Dr. Andrew Snelling on one of our trips that we took, and you can see right here, this is the great unconformity line right here, the tilted crystalline basement rocks underneath here, the beginning of the Tapete sandstone is right there at that line. So we go into Blacktail Canyon, and you can get hands-on with this massive erosional event. And if you haven't picked up on it yet, we're talking about the beginning of the flood for this erosion. So when you go to Blacktail Canyon on a river trip with us, you can get one hand on creation, one hand on destruction. Creation and destruction side by side. Very, very powerful. Now, taking a look here, we have a huge amount of erosion, and when we examine this great unconformity up close, you'll notice there are numerous rocks and stones and gravels ground up and embedded right there at that erosional boundary. That line, that's the great unconformity. And look at all those rounded rocks, all those rocks. We have a lot of granites, we have a lot of quartz and quartzite, and all kinds of stuff, schist that's been plucked up. A lot of the stuff eroded and surrounded and left at that erosional boundary. So you can see here, the tilted rocks, we call the Vishnu schist. That's a metamorphic rock in nature. We have some veins coming up of different rocks. We have igneous intrusions and things like that. We take a look at these rocks, and they've been scoured off, and at that scouring, we see a tremendous amount of erosion and tremendous amount of debris. Now, looking at these rocks, when we take a look at them up close, many times these rocks are nicely rounded. Take a look at that nice rounded rock here. It's like a piece of quartz or quartzite here, and we can see this sediment actually goes up and over this rock. This whole thing was formed at the same time, you can see. And look, this pretty strong, hard rock, look how smooth and rounded that is. Now, since you guys are from Colorado, you're a pretty clever bunch by default, I know that. But where do we typically find round and smooth stones today, you guys? In rivers and streams where there's fast-moving water, right? Where did David go to look for the smooth stones to slay Goliath? The Bible tells us he went down to the brook or the stream. And why was that? Well, David was no geologist, but he was smart enough to know fast-moving water tumbles these rocks, knocking off the sharp edges, rounding them smooth. So, we typically find round, smooth stones where we find fast-moving water, correct? So, when we examine this Tapete sandstone, when we examine this great unconformities we see right here, and we find numerous rounded rocks and stones embedded within that great unconformity boundary, what does that tell us? You might say scientifically, geologically, observationally, what does that tell us about the way the Tapete sandstone was laid down? Guess what? It tells us not only was it laid down by water, but it was laid down, it was deposited by fast-moving water, right? Now, we can look at this and determine this Tapete sandstone was deposited by fast-moving water. Now, here's the real kicker, the real interesting thing. Not only do we find round, smooth stones and pebbles embedded within this Tapete sandstone, but guys, we find entire boulders embedded within this Tapete sandstone. Boulders that are as big as washing machines, boulders that are up to 15 to 20 feet in diameter, and they're fairly round and smooth. In fact, we look at this, we're not just talking about fast-moving water, we're talking about a lot of fast-moving water. Think about it, van-sized boulders left behind in there. Now that's a huge force. So when we look at this Tapete sandstone, we look at this great unconformity, and we can determine that it was deposited by fast-moving water, the definition of a flood has something to do with a lot of fast-moving water typically, right? So let's continue. So the great unconformity, write that down in your mind, write it down on a note, whatever it is, that's one of the first points there. When we again look at that same place, that same Tapete sandstone, we have another major thing. Not only the major mystery of erosion there, not only do we have that great unconformity, which is to this day a major mystery to most geologists. In fact, you watch a show on the National Geographic, Discovery, History Channel, whatever it is, oftentimes they're going to talk about the great unconformity and what a major mystery it is. We'll talk a little bit more about that and why in just a moment. But where we happen to find an explosion of erosion, if you will, a massive erosional event, we also find another explosion known as the Cambrian explosion. Anybody ever heard of that before? The Cambrian explosion, or sometimes known as the Cambrian explosion of life. And the Cambrian explosion of life, what it is, it's another major, and it's a worldwide mystery, this Cambrian explosion of life. Basically, we look around the world and we see at the very bottom no fossil record to speak of, save things like blue-green cyanobacteria, algae, stromatolite-looking things, but basically no body fossils of any type. And that's all the way from here, all these tilted rocks, we would see no fossils, no fossils, no fossils, no fossils, then boom, at that Tapete sandstone, we find an explosion within the fossil record that represents nearly every major phyla of life known to man. An explosion within the fossil record. Below that line, no major fossil record. But at that line and seen around the world, there's an explosion within the fossil record. Now, geologists call this Cambrian explosion, called the Cambrian explosion of life, because it seems as if life suddenly had a magic leap forward, going from no life to an explosion of life. And it's a major mystery. In fact, it's one of the largest mysteries of evolutionary biology, because it goes opposite of their predicted models oftentimes, which says at the bottommost you should find simple single-cell organisms slowly, steadily, gradually working their way up through the fossil record, becoming more and more complex over time. You should see a nice steady transition within the fossil record. But friends, that is not what we find. What we find, again, is basically nothing, then boom, an explosion within the fossil record. Now, that Cambrian explosion of life, they call it, happens to coexist at the exact same place, the exact same moment in time as this massive explosion of erosion in geology. Now, this Cambrian explosion is a worldwide physical feature. Likewise, that same great unconformity we're talking about, that great unconformity is also a worldwide physical feature. Worldwide erosion by fast-moving water, worldwide explosion within the fossil record. Now, looking at this, what are fossils? Are they living things or are they dead things? They were once living, now they're pretty well dead. From a biblical creation perspective, what are we looking at, you guys? Again, if that erosional event marks the beginning, the onset of the flood, what else would you expect to find from a flood? Well, as our friend from Answers in Genesis, Ken Ham, has a pretty well-known saying, you guys probably know it. We'd expect to find billions of dead things buried in rock layers, laid down by water all over the earth. That's what you would expect to find. And of course, what is it we do find? We find billions of dead things buried in rock layers, laid down by water all over the earth. The earth is a massive worldwide watery graveyard, I believe, from that catastrophe in Noah's day. An explosion of erosion coinciding with this Cambrian explosion, but not the Cambrian explosion of life, rather it's an explosion of death. Say it with me, explosion of death. Very good. So a worldwide explosion of death, and that's what the fossil record is. It's a bunch of dead and buried things. So worldwide, where we see massive water erosion, we find massive worldwide death and burial. You start to look at this and tell me, hey, yeah, this is a global flood. These are the exact conditions that we would expect to find with a global flood. So the second evidence, and at the exact same place, exact same Tapete sandstone beginning, we see that Cambrian explosion within the fossil record. That's my second favorite thing about that specific zone. The third thing, looking at this, when we again look back at this Tapete sandstone, if we can determine that this Tapete sandstone was deposited by fast-moving water, the next thing we need to look at is how far-reaching does this Tapete sandstone go? What is the extent of some of these sedimentary layers? So looking at the Tapete sandstone at the bottom of the Grand Canyon once again, we can determine it was deposited by fast-moving water, right? Now, if I told you not only can you see the Tapete sandstone standing at the rim like I showed you in that picture, but that same Tapete sandstone, that same water-laid rock layer, covers the entirety of the Grand Canyon, 277 miles, that's a pretty big, fast-moving water event. You might say a flood, right? Now, what kind of flood events do we see happening of that size today? We don't typically have floods that are 277 miles in length, right? That's a pretty big event. So you might say the present is not the key to the past. But what if I told you, not only does that Tapete sandstone cover all the Grand Canyon, that same Tapete sandstone covers the entire state of Arizona. That's a statewide massive flood, right? Pretty big. Now, what if I told you that Tapete sandstone covers the entire Four Corners states, Colorado, Utah, New Mexico, Arizona? That's a really, really big flood. But wait, there's more, right? Because what if I told you that we've studied and shown records and evidence through core samples and drilling and oil research, mapping out great things. Dr. Tim Clary has done fantastic work in this field to map out the distribution. What if I told you this very same Tapete sandstone that we're talking about tonight, deposited by fast-moving water, is not only found at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, but is found blanketing the continent? Now, friends, that is a continent-wide, fast-moving water event. And I don't know, again, what Webster gives for the definition of a flood, but I think it has something to do with a fast-moving water event covering a landscape. This Tapete sandstone actually goes further up into Canada. It goes all the way up. You can actually trace it into Greenland. So the yellow you see in this picture shows you the distribution across the United States of that Tapete sandstone. Again, that sandstone deposited by fast-moving water. Friends, this is direct physical, scientific, observational evidence of a fast-moving water across an entire continent. A continent-wide flood, if you will, right? But are we done there? But wait, there's more. It gets a lot bigger. Not only can we trace the Tapete sandstone across North America, that very same Tapete sandstone goes all the way across North Africa. It goes in through southern Israel, through southern Jordan. And anybody ever been to southern Jordan? Been to Petra? Okay. Petra is carved into the very same Tapete sandstone equivalent you see here at the Grand Canyon and across the United States. Anybody been through southern Israel, through like Timnah region? You have the exact same great unconformity down there. In fact, there's a really neat feature down there, Timnah National Park area, where you can see the Pillars of Solomon. And at the base of the Pillars of Solomon, you have the exact same great unconformity that's at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. And you have the exact same Tapete sandstone equivalent on top of that. And in fact, all the way across the United States, you can trace it out. Last year, I was actually over in Wisconsin, a place called Baraboo region. So there's a place called Devil's Lake State Park. You have the same great unconformity over there. And so I was studying this and saying, these rocks I'm looking at are almost identical to what I see and study at the Grand Canyon. So we're looking at the exact same rocks, the exact same feature from, of course, the exact same event, right? So we're looking at this, and so you can see it, you can trace it not only across the United States, but across North Africa, into parts of Europe and into Asia. We can see this is a cross-continental, in other words, worldwide fast-moving water event. A worldwide flood, exactly. So, in fact, here's a neat little comparison. Grand Canyon on the left, picture I took, the guy with his arms reaching up to hold the rock, that is Dr. Danny Faulkner. You guys, I think, have had him out here before, right? Astronomy professor for 30 years, nearly over there at the University of South Carolina, Lancaster. Now works with Answers in Genesis as their resident astronomer, and works with us on Grand Canyon river trips through the Grand Canyon. We do a geology by day and astronomy by night river trip, which is fantastic. It's out of this world. Okay. I'm a dad. I can make those jokes. It's okay. It really is a rock star tour. I've got a lot more where that came from. Trust me, my kids know. All right. So anyhow, looking at the Grand Canyon on the left, you can see the Tapete sandstone, and southern Israel, the same Tapete sand equivalent over there. Look at the comparison of geology. I mean, you're looking, it looks very similar because it is. It's the same equivalent rocks. It's amazing that we can see this. Now, the extent of these rock layers, to me, is one of the massive, huge evidences of a worldwide flood. Because to get the same rocks from here to there, moved by fast-moving water, friends, that is a continent-wide, worldwide, fast-moving water event. Again, a flood. So when someone asks me, what is my number one evidence, what's the one thing I can point to? If I had, 10 minutes on the phone with somebody, man, tell them about this Tapete sandstone, this great unconformity, this massive Cambrian explosion, the extent of these layers in particular, it's incredible. So we look at the layers of the Grand Canyon, and we can see that what we call flood geology, the evidence is right there in front of us. We can see really good direct physical evidence of a worldwide flood. Now that Tapete sandstone we talked about is only the beginning of that sequence that we see stacked up, right? That's just the beginning stages of the flood. We have other layers on top of that we believe were also deposited during the flood. And as floodwaters receded, some layers, some sediment was actually pulled off of there, and we're actually missing thousands of feet of sedimentary rock layers on top of the Grand Canyon. We call them the Grand Staircase layers. And those are layers of rock you can see as you go up north towards Utah. We can see thousands of feet of other rock layers that should extend across the entire landscape, but have been scoured off and pulled off at the Grand Canyon. We believe that took place at the end of the flood as floodwaters are receding off the continents. We call it sheet erosion. Like when you go to the ocean, to the beach, you can see a wave rises up and it carries with it debris and sediment, right? But then when the wave draws back down, it pulls and removes with it some sediment. And it leaves a nice beveled, scoured plain. So imagine that, but on a worldwide scale. Huge amounts of water are pulling freshly laid soft sediment off the continents, beveling them down to the top of the Grand Canyon, where we see the Kaibab limestone. And then we, of course, have a canyon now cut down through the rest of those layers down to the basement rocks. So, quickly, we're going to kind of dive into change the topic a little bit, not to necessarily the depositing of these layers, but the carving down through of these layers. I'm going to talk briefly about some even new evidences describing carving of the Grand Canyon. And we see the Grand Canyon formed not necessarily by the Colorado River over millions of years of slow, gradual erosion, but we see at Canyon Ministries the carving of the Grand Canyon by an event that took place after the flood. We believe that there was a massive, huge lake system that was ponded up in the middle of the Colorado Plateau, and after the flood, in fact, probably a few hundred years after the flood itself, we have another regional, smaller flood that breached through the wall of the Colorado Plateau, breaching through what we call the Kaibab Plateau, and then this huge amount of water spilling through, carving out the Grand Canyon rapidly. We're going to talk about that. So, if you take a look at this map, this picture here, you can see the Grand Canyon down here on the left, or on kind of the bottom toward the left, and you can see this whole landscape. Now, when you look at the topography of the landscape, you can pretty clearly see a basin formed and impressed within the landscape. This basin would house a really big lake. So here, going back and forth, you can kind of see, you see the outline, shoreline type edges of this lake system. You can see as it fills in up to here, Grand Junction. See as it kind of fills into that area where a big, huge lake used to exist. Now you can see the topography of the shoreline. In fact, you can jump on Google Earth. You can pretty easily see even on Google Earth a depression, an area. And so this picture actually I did with some software I have where you can actually just take the landscape and say, give me water at a certain level. So for example, I think this was 5,800 feet in elevation of water, and see where it fills in. And you start to look at the shoreline, the topography areas, and you can see there's a pretty good basin where a massive amount of water would fill in, creating a big lake system. There's a lake down here, kind of going off the screen. This is what we call oftentimes Hopi Lake, or sometimes known as Lake Bittahoche. That's what I like to call it, oftentimes. And then going up here, you kind of get to what we call either sometimes called Grand Lake, sometimes called Canyonlands Lake, and there's another lake up into Utah as well that we would see would be part of this big, massive lake system. But this big lake system was in the middle, we believe, of what we call the Colorado Plateau, which I've outlined here in the kind of yellowish color here so you can see it better. Now, the Colorado Plateau is not exactly flat on top. The Colorado Plateau is actually shaped more like a giant bowl with a big basin in the middle. Now, with a giant bowl, when you start to pour water into a bowl, where does it collect? In the bottom, in the low point, right? So what we see here is a big basin with water from melting snow up in Colorado and Utah, rivers and streams, rivulets, all coming together to start to fill up this bowl, this big, huge basin. Now, the rim of this Colorado Plateau has these big, high point mountains and uplifted landscape. So it's like a giant bowl. And now, looking at the Colorado Plateau we have today, we have numerous rivers and streams flowing into this basin, but really there's only one major exit route of any good size by which water can drain out of that bowl. Only one big crack, you might say, in the side of that bowl. Guess what that one big crack happens to be? Grand Canyon. And what flows through the Grand Canyon? Colorado River. That river is the collection of all this water that would normally make a big lake system. It has a big breach in the side of it. And this lake system, when you put all three lakes and perhaps at their totality, we're looking at a huge, massive lake on the landscape. Look at the size of these lakes even compared to the the Great Lakes. We're talking about a huge, huge body of water. We're talking about thousands of cubic miles held in the middle of this Colorado Plateau. This is perhaps at the maximum extent we could have for this lake system. That's a lot of water. Now you have a giant bowl with a whole bunch of water in it. What happens to that water when you fill that bowl beyond its capacity? Anybody ever filled a bowl beyond its capacity? Yeah? What happens? It overflows. It spills over. Let's zoom out and show you the Grand Canyon here in comparison. It's kind of hard to see on here how big the lakes are, but let's zoom in, show you guys this entire Grand Canyon of 277 miles down here. Makes the Grand Canyon look like nothing. So, if you were standing on the rim of the Grand to about here, that's a really big body of water, a really big lake. Now, what happens to a body of water or to a bowl when you fill it beyond its capacity? What happens when you have a big earthen dam and you start to spill water over it? Well, erosion starts. And even starting off as a little bit of erosion, you get a little bit of erosion, more water, more erosion, more erosion, more water. Pretty soon you end up with a catastrophic exponential runaway process that would drain this entire lake system of thousands of cubic miles of water through one single exit route. If you pour that much water through one single point, it's absolutely going to carve a canyon of a really big size in nature. Now, what evidence is beyond just looking at the physical landscape and topography do we have? Well, my area of research for the past 3 or 4 years has been the lowest part of this lake, we call Hopi Lake or Lake Hochi. And this is the reason for this is because here's where the lake is at. Here's where my house is at. Pretty. So because it's pretty close to me and accessible, I've done most of my research in this lower lake basin. And so this whole region up there, this would be the lowest part of the lake. At some point, we believe that as these lakes were draining through, perhaps separated into different lake channels, channelized coming in, so that eventually what formed just lake down here started to spill through, carving the little Colorado Gorge. And as the water from the north was coming down, continually flowing through here, it carved Marble Canyon. So we have these little mini side canyon tributaries incised into the landscape. But my area has been the kind of lake region down here. And it's not just been my area, it's also been Ed's area as well. Because we were part of a research project this year with Steve Austin, Ed here, and Tom folks. We put together some research studying this. In fact, this is the title of a talk that Dr. Steve Austin gave. Does Hopi Lake hold water? And so, looking at this landscape, it was trying to find physical evidence for the lake system. So, very own Ed right here is part of that research trip. And if you guys, or research experience, I should say, you didn't get a chance to come out and study the landscape yet. Looking at this landscape, this entire big, massive lake system that we have is not just a new idea. In fact, it's not even a crazy creation. This lake system has been proposed since the 1800s, going all the way back to guys like John Newberry, who studied this entire landscape. John S. Newberry surveyed and found that evidence for a big freshwater lake. And ideas were coming about even in the 1800s that the Grand Canyon may have been carved catastrophically by a lot of water spilling through there. So he surveyed this whole bit of Lake Bitahochi, kind of where Hopi Lake is at, and started realizing there's evidence that there was a really big lake. That idea was proposed, way back in the 1800s. And then continuing from there, even the name Hopi Lake we talked about all the way until the 1930s. So for a while, this was one of the leading theories and ideas of information. Water in a lake. Now, strange as it might sound, that's still a theory out there. It's still a growing theory, in fact, among not just creationists, but even secular geologists. We've got guys that work in the state of Arizona, geologists, that come out and they look at this lake system and they start to put together and realize, hey, there's evidence that this lake was out here, and maybe this slow carving Colorado River over millions of years, maybe that river couldn't cut it. But what could is a lot of water. And in my opinion, that Colorado River theory just doesn't hold a lot of water. But what does hold a lot of water is a lot of water. So, yeah, there you go. So we're looking at this whole idea of a big, massive lake. Now, what physical evidence are we talking about? Well, when you go and examine where Hopi Lake, Lake Bitahochi was, we find what we call the Bitahochi Formation. Now, the Bitahochi Formation is found in the form of greenish-looking clays oftentimes. You can see here, this is a formation called White Cone. It's actually made up of the Bitahochi Formation. The Bitahochi Formation is a freshwater lake bed deposit. In other words, it's lake mud, okay? Now, fresh water, and we know that because when you go and examine it, you can find freshwater mollusks in there, freshwater animals living in lakes. So we have here in the middle of the desert evidence that there was a really big lake. And when I say really big lake, it's because this freshwater mud bottom deposit, this Bitahochi Formation, again, is found in the form of greenish-looking clays, which is pretty indicative of deep water environments. where there's not a lot of oxidation deep down, so they remain as kind of greenish colored lake clays oftentimes. Dr. John Whitmore did a lot of his PhD research on lake bed deposits, especially the Green River Formation, which is actually not too far north from here. And I took him and his geology students out here to study this whole landscape, and we were looking at White Cone and other places in this area, and he said, this is absolutely a lake bed deposit, freshwater lake environment. And as we're standing there, actually we're standing right by White Cone, looking from there, you can see right nearby there, just a little bit further south, maybe southeast of there, or southwest of there, you can see this Bitahoche Formation, and then there's a beeline straight across the desert. You can actually see where the Grand Canyon starts to begin, where the Little Colorado River goes and channels in, and this open landscape from here to the Grand Canyon. In other words, if we're standing here by this freshwater lake bed, there's nothing between where this lake is deposited, this material, nothing between here and the Grand Canyon to stop this lake. So that tells you if water is found here, it would have to cover this landscape. And we find the Bitahoche Formation, the basin of this lake basin, the bottom of this whole massive bowl, right around 4,200 feet. That's by camera in Arizona. We find the bottom of this Bitahoche lake basin about 4,200 feet, yet we find the shoreline perimeters, the height of some of these places, from 6,300 to 6,600 feet in elevation, where we find the Bitahoche Formation. So that tells us, you guys, this lake we're talking about, in places, could have been up to 2,000 feet deep. We're talking about a huge body of water. Now, of course, we see the freshwater, plus we see the freshwater lake bed deposits. We see other things in this region. We can see some carbonate formations that appear to be formed from basically dry lake evaporates and things like that. In fact, looking closer, here's a sample that I collected just this year. We can actually see these banded deposits. Showing this to Dr. Steve Austin, he says, hey, looking at that, Dr. John Whitmore, who I was talking to just recently on, he said, this looks a lot like freshwater stromatolites, where there are layers of algae that grow on top, and then sediment comes on top of there and covers it, and the algae grows on top, and it kind of makes these banded deposits. Now, the interesting thing is, this rock right here, bottom of it, this is basalt from the San Francisco Peaks volcanic lava flow. On top of it is where this deposit is at. Now, if you look at the geology of the landscape, the volcanoes were one of the last features to happen there. All the other limestone type, lime-rich carbonate formations are actually found underneath that, like the Kaibab limestone. Yet here we have clear lava flow evidence with carbonate formation on top of it. The only way that we're looking at this is perhaps this is evidence that this was a big lake, and this is actually found right at the shoreline perimeter of where we see the lake edge coming up to. Pretty cool. This is actually still ongoing research. We're actually taking some of these samples and sending them off for strontium isotope readings to try to pinpoint, the exact origination of this carbonate formation. So, brand new stuff. You're actually one of the very first groups to see these pictures. Kind of cool. So anyhow, we see this, but what other evidence do we see for a big lake? Well, when we go and examine where Hopi Lake used to be, we can find around the shoreline that there are actually fossil casts of ice crystal casts that are left behind, which tells us probably a freshwater lake, because seawater, salty water, doesn't really freeze very easily in probably a shoreline environment. And we also find tundra swan fossils and tundra swan tracks. Now, where do tundra swans typically live? In the tundra. Very good. Hence the name tundra swans. Way far north. Yet we find them in Arizona? Why in the world would that be? Well, our best understanding of that is because this lake existed into the Ice Age. So this was a post-flood freshwater lake that existed well into the Ice Age, when of course the Ice Age didn't cover the whole Earth in ice. That's not what the Ice Age is. It simply means that there was ice and glaciers in a lot more places than we see today. But it would have brought down the temperature so that Arizona, the desert we see today, was not the desert in the past. In fact, we find in the Bitahoche Formation, we find camel fossils from the post-flood environment. We find beaver fossils in a post-flood freshwater environment. We find, again, fossil tundra swan footprints and even their fossils and things like that. Of course, they don't typically live down there, but during an ice age with cooler temperatures, yeah, they'd be living and thriving around there. So we look at this, and then we also have volcanoes that have erupted into this lake. We can see evidence of volcanic eruptions that call the Hopi Buttes area. These Hopi Buttes are volcanic throats of lava that have erupted into the lake basin, And we know that because it's actually intermixed. The freshwater mud bottom deposit is intermixed within some of the lava flows, and we tend to find a lot of basically crystalline lava flows that we see, these kind of straight pillars of hexagonal lava flow columns that usually, oftentimes, are formed in contact with water, where there's rapid cooling. We see this kind of columnar basalt lava flows that we see. So again, ongoing research there. But the other interesting thing in the project that I've been working on with Ed and a few other guys has been working on these lakeshore strand lines, we believe. Now, looking at a lake, oftentimes we see that there are shoreline erosional markers. Basically, you have lakes that rise and they kind of sink back down, they rise up. And so we have these kind of incised, lines along the landscape. Now, one of the things that people have asked for a long time, well, where are these lakeshore environments? Do we see strand lines anywhere? There's a great place just east of Flagstaff that I came across last year that appears to be some shoreline strands. And if you can see here, there's these lines going across the landscape, these terrain lines. You start to look at there and say, You draw a line across there and look at the elevation. These lines go exactly opposite of the rise of the contour that we see here. In other words, if you had a lake, you would have it rising up against there. You'd see ledges being cut in by wave flow action. You look at this and you can look at the topography, you can say, it's rising from low elevation. These lines you can see here through the picture barely, they go exactly in the same line that you see the elevation. So what are we looking at here? So one of the ideas that we proposed that we're still working on, it's still a work in progress, is that this perhaps could be a shoreline environment from this Lake Bittahoche, or this Hopi Lake. And here's a aerial drone footage video that I took and shows you what these lakeshore strand lines kind of would look like. And if you've ever studied anything about lake beds, evaporated lakes, or lakes that have been in one place and then the lake water drained away rapidly or catastrophically, sometimes you'll find shoreline strand lines around there. Sometimes you won't. And in some cases, you wouldn't even expect to find shoreline strand lines if you had water continually rising up, rising up, rising up. You wouldn't even expect to find it across the landscape necessarily. But here, we have a location that perhaps could actually be these strand lines. We're actually working on an upcoming paper to be released this next year at the International Conference on Creationism at ICC. So that'll be a little bit more detailed paper and presentation we hope to get together. But this is an area that needs further research, but it's a promising area, I would say, taking a look at this landscape. And you can see these lines. So they're kind of throughout the landscape and area. If you ever want to come out, take a look at it with me, Grand Canyon area, come out, take a trip with us, and then I'll be running out to the desert here, and we'll go look at some really cool evidence for what I believe was this big lake. So when we have evidence for the lake, we have the freshwater mud bottom deposit, we have the fossils, we have all this evidence. We have evidence that the lake was there. The question we should ask, and I'm almost done, but the question we should ask is, what happened to all that water? If we had a big, huge lake there, did that lake just simply evaporate and dry up? Not at all. We know what dried up, evaporated lakes look like, right? We have Lake Bonneville, and we have the Bonneville Salt Flats, and we have Salt Lake up in Utah, which is the remnant of this big, massive lake, and it is very, very salty, and it's evaporated over time and concentrated all these salts. We have the Bonneville Salt Flats. The evidence of a big, massive lake that slowly dried up is that. Where I live, studying Hopi Lake, we have no major salt deposits. It appears as if this massive body of water was there, and then suddenly it was gone. Well, when you look at the entire Colorado Plateau, the only possible exit route for that kind of water, the only crack in the side of that giant bowl, the Grand Canyon, right? So what do we see happening here? This water, we believe, had risen all the way up to the edge of the Kaibab Plateau, as you see here. And then somehow, either by spilling over, starting that erosional process, or maybe by an earthquake action that kind of triggered some liquefaction that perhaps started to release this huge amount of water, or perhaps by karst tunneling through this limestone plateau, whatever one of those mechanisms we believe happened, when that water started to spill through, it's an unstoppable force. A huge amount of water drained rapidly, catastrophically, coming in together to form the Grand Canyon. A lot of water in a little bit of time, we would say, not a long time in a little bit of water. Again, when we look at this, we can even see the inlets of where these two big lakes came through. And here's an example here of the Little Colorado River Gorge. Now, the Little Colorado River Gorge is not that little. It's actually about 3,200 feet deep. Pretty incredible. Yet you drive only 30 minutes down the road to Cameron, and that gorge is only about 70 to 100 feet deep. So you go from about 70 to 100 feet deep to 3,200 feet deep, just like that. Now that's not a little trickle of water spilling through. That is the evidence of a catastrophic amount of water spilling into the landscape. So what we say is, a lot of water did this in a little bit of time, not water. And we also would say, there's a canyon here, not because there's a river down below, but there's a river down below because there is a canyon. We believe the Grand Canyon was opened first, rapidly and catastrophically, and remains to this day as the exit route for all that water on the Colorado Plateau. Instead of ponding up, making a big, huge lake system, it's now continually free-flowing. Yet if we dammed up the Grand Canyon, we would have a big, massive lake system, right? In fact, haven't we dammed up that Colorado River in a couple places? Our two biggest man-made lakes in America, Lake Powell and Lake Mead, are made from that same exact water that flows through the Grand Canyon. Now, those dams are roughly 600 feet tall with pretty good-sized lakes. Imagine if we dammed up the Grand Canyon a mile tall. Imagine we could easily have a 2,000-foot deep lake behind that, easily. Yet we have a free-flowing exit route to this day. So a lot of water in a little bit of time, not a long time, and a little bit of water, and a canyon, not because there's a river down below, but a river because there is a canyon. Rapidly and catastrophically is the name of the game when we look at the carving of the Grand Canyon. So with that, thank you guys. And do we need to take a break and jump right into questions? Okay, we can take some questions if you guys have any. I know that's kind of a speed run through some Grand Canyon geology. I do talk quickly, so questions. Oh, we're going to bring the mic down. That way all of our friends watching online right now and in the video, they can actually hear the question being asked. That's okay. We got millions of years to wait. It's fine.
Hello? Have we got it now?
There we go.
Okay. All right. So who's got the first question? Okay.
Thank you, Nate.
Yeah.
What's always puzzled me is that the north rim of the Grand Canyon is at 8,000 feet, south rim's about over 7,000 feet, and you've got this river down here, and it, in other words, the river doesn't appear to cut through the low part. It seems to cut right through an 8,000-foot plateau. Why?
So are you talking about the differences between the north rim versus the south rim?
No, no, not just the north rim and the south rim, but the fact that the entire plateau seems to come up. When you drive to the Grand Canyon, you drive uphill.
You're exactly
Normally, I mean, water goes downhill.
Right.
And but this, in the Grand Canyon, it seems to cut right through a high plateau, and that's always puzzled me.
Yes. I'm glad you asked that question. So first of all, it does cut through a high plateau. The Kaibab Plateau in itself is a high point. And so it cuts through there. But if you look at the entirety of the Colorado Plateau, this region where the Grand Canyon spill is carved and where the spillway happened, it's one of the lowest points along the entire Colorado Plateau. There's only one other section to the north of that that is actually slightly in lower elevation today. However, today's elevation, we believe, is not the elevation we not necessarily saw in the past when it was carved. You talked about the difference between the elevation of the north rim and the south rim. So one of the great explanations we're working on is, why do we have a difference in that elevation? Well, first of all, it does rise up. It's kind of an uphill dome. But we even see evidence that we have called isostatic rebound. Now, isostatic rebound happens when you have a bunch of weight on top and you have an equalized pressure underneath. If you remove a bunch of weight off the top, what happens? That pressure underneath pushes up from there, and it rebounds and kind of rises up until the pressure becomes equalized. Now, we look at this Kaibab Plateau. Imagine, in the picture here you see, this is the Kaibab Plateau. Imagine if we have water that spills over through one side of that plateau, and it cuts away part of that landscape. It cuts away part of that weight and that material. If this plateau, if we see, imagine this was like a block of wood sitting on top of a bunch of water. Now, if you had a block of wood and you sawed away one corner of that block of wood and it's floating on water, what's going to happen to that block that's floating? It's going to naturally tilt. Okay, the weight has been removed on one side, the weight on the backside pushes down, and you have a tilting of this block. Now imagine instead of a block of wood on water, you have a big cold slab of material, a big, like a craton or some kind of big cold slab of rock sitting on top of liquefied, mantle. Basically, you have liquefied rock underneath with a weight sitting on top of it, kind of buoyant, kind of floating on there. If you remove a tremendous amount of material on one side, entire seesaw teeter-totter is going to tilt. And so what we see happening here is that the north rim versus the south rim, what's happened is it cuts through here, and when you see this big tilting, the reason why the north rim, I believe, is higher elevation. In fact, you can actually see on the landscape, as you're coming up, you're approaching the Grand Canyon, you're exactly right, you're going uphill. I think on both edges of the Grand Canyon, we actually have tilting. So we have the Grand Canyon connected, we have removal of that material in the middle, and then as a result of that, where that material is removed, the landscape responds and it rebounds and it tilts backwards. Now it tilts back on the south rim a little bit, but most of that teeter-totter seesaw, most of that big slab of rock actually goes to the north. That's the majority of that Kaibab Plateau. So that's the place where we'd have the greatest amount of tilting and seesaw. And when you look at the landscape, we can see that there's actually floating rocks along the mantle here. We'll go past this through tomographic. Let's see, I'm trying to find the picture here. The Kaibab Plateau extends up through this area. We have evidence that the landscape has tilted more on the north rim, and north of there, it's actually pushed down into the landscape down further through tomographic readings. So we can see that it would initially, we believe, cut through a plateau that was fairly straight and even, removing a bunch of material. Because more of that seesaw is going on the left-hand side, like the north rim area, it actually rises up further on that side, creating a higher north rim compared to a south rim that we have today. So this process of isostatic rebound, removal of weight and material, causes a rebound and causes tilting of landscapes, and actually push down north of the Grand Canyon, actually push this plateau down into the ground a little bit further. We can see that through a heat map readings that show us that there's actually probably a thinner section or perhaps pushed down into this landscape. And so initially the conditions would be more flat than what we see today. Grand Canyon gets carved through there. We have an upbound uprising, and the north rim actually rose a little bit further higher than the south rim. Now that's work that we're actually working on with a physicist right now to kind of really model that out and be able to tell that. But does that help answer that question a little bit? Hopefully. Yeah, so we look at the entire Colorado Plateau. One of the lowest points, again, is where we see the Grand Canyon carved through. And it's changed in response to the removal of the weight of all that rock. We've actually had some rebound, some movement. And we can see that in a lot of places where there are cliff edges, sheer cliff edges have been washed away. We have isostatic rebound, we have uplift, we have movement of the landscape in response to the weight being removed from it. So Grand Canyon is actually one of the neat things we're looking at right now in studying the topography and the terrain of the landscape and trying to figure out what do we see underneath there. Because even deep in the earth, we get some clues deep in the earth as for what has happened on the surface.
I'm curious if you've done any work on how long it might have taken for that body of water to empty.
Great question. We don't know the exact speed at which it was draining nor eroding because we weren't there to see it. But we place it anywhere from days to weeks to maybe a few months, basically. That amount of water rapidly and catastrophically. I tend to go weeks to months probably. But as we're looking at this, we're talking about a lot of water very, very quickly. Not 6 to perhaps 70 million years as some have proposed, but a lot of water spilling through. So weeks to months to remove a tremendous amount of material rushing and roaring through there. Great question. I forgot to totally mention that, so I'm glad you did. We have another one up front here.
Yeah, I guess I'm trying to Okay, I was wondering a little bit about, you talk about the uniformitarians and the present is the key to the past, and I'm thinking, okay, so what in the present do we see big planed off surfaces that are planed off flat, taking a long time to do it without channeling and without, making something that's not flat? Do we see anything in the present that would do that? Maybe you already answered it because they're confused by the great unconformity. And then also in the present, do we see massive amounts of creatures getting buried to create fossils slowly. I mean,
Right,
I mean,
yeah.
I see stuff. I go walking around. I see like something died, and the already the skull is, you know, the rest of the creature is gone, and you see it's down to bone, and the bones have actually turned white. They're all bleached in the sun, and deteriorating and crumbling, and
Right.
and it's like, how do they think that could happen slowly?
So fossilization requires rapid burial. I mean, that's one of the things that we see, and that is one of the things that most geologists and paleontologists would agree on nowadays. Whereas in the past, you may have seen a sign in a museum that talked about, you know, animal died, slowly fell to, you know, the bottom of a body of water, was slowly covered up by particle, eventually becoming buried, eventually become a fossil. That's been the name of the game for a long time, but in a lot of museums, in fact, I've seen them in museums around the world, from Los Angeles to London, where you can see that they're changing their tune on some of these signs, where they used to talk about slow particle deposition to bury animals and create fossils. They're now also coming to the conclusion that they were the result of catastrophic processes, so catastrophic burial, which is required for that. Because something that dies in the ocean today, you know, if the fossil record we see on the landscape was produced by oceans and something lives there and slowly falls to the ocean floor and slowly covered up particle by particle eventually, well, we would expect to find a lot of fossils in today's oceans. If the oceans produce fossils, we should find fossils in today's oceans.
Right.
And few people realize this, but we don't tend to find a lot of fossils in today's oceans. Nor do we find fossils forming in today's oceans. Why? Because that's not how fossils are formed. Things that die in the ocean today, what happens to them? They float, they bloat, they get picked apart by scavengers, right? They get eaten and consumed. Even entire whale carcasses that may sink down to the bottom of the ocean floor, even on the ocean floor, tremendous scavengers. There are crabs and other crustaceans and hagfish and eels, specialized feeders that consume even the very bones of whales. There are creatures that work their way up and down the column of mud on the seafloor to find any tiny piece of microscopic food. Things that die in the ocean today, they don't become fossils, they become food, right?
Yeah.
Likewise, something that dies on the landscape, a coyote or something that dies up here, it's not going to become a fossil. You're exactly right. What happens to it? It decomposes.
Okay, so that's a little bit of
Yeah.
a straw man of their beliefs, because they don't really believe that anymore. So
they're starting to
basically
change their tune.
they're changing their tune to have maybe a lot of catastrophes over millions of years.
So the answer would be regional, localized catastrophes. So what they would say, for example, if you go to Los Angeles and the Natural History Museum there, the dinosaur exhibit, there's a big slab of a number of coelophysis dinosaurs, and the plaque there says, what happened to these dinosaurs? And they say, based upon the evidence we see here, it basically says, based upon the evidence we see here, these coelophysis dinosaurs are one of dozens that were found in a quarry in New Mexico. Based upon the conditions in which they're found, it appears that they died and were buried in a flood. Now you go over to near north of Chicago, there's another museum has this very same coelophysis dinosaurs from the very same quarry. They also say buried in a flood. So they start to look at flood, but of course they're not going to say the flood. They're going to say a catastrophe here, a catastrophe there. But you start to add up all these catastrophes, and you know what? The landscape is covered by catastrophes. You might as well say there was a catastrophe, a flood.
Yeah,
so,
especially when you see the extent of the layers.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you're right, and many times the idea had been for a long time slow, gradual burial. But the more that we understand how fossils are formed, the more that even the secular scientific community is coming to the conclusion that it requires rapid burial. So they would say it was just a special circumstance, a special event that may have happened here or there. But again, when you start to add up all these special events and these regional events and these catastrophes, to me it starts to really ring clearly, loud, true. We're talking about a global flood catastrophe. It's really right when we see the extent of some of these layers in which these fossils are formed. Good question, good. I like it.
You were talking a little bit about some type of formation, and you can go to Mount St. Helens and the rapid deposition, very fine strata, and then the rapid carving of the canyon, even through the basement rocks.
Very good. Rapid deposition and rapid removal.
Question. You talked about the blanketing of the layers in the United States, Israel, North Africa, and all that. So we have the Grand Canyon, the big thing in catastrophe from a flood. Is there any place in the world where there's other canyons like this that have been formed?
Certainly, yeah. So
Because I'm not into geology.
a little further north, we have the channeled scablands area that we believe was formed from another lake called Lake Missoula that goes, the eastern Washington all the way into Montana area. A big, massive lake that geologists all agree was up there and was by a big ice dam probably. And the ice dam breached, this massive lake drained all the way toward the west coast, and they believe it carved out the Columbia River Gorge very, very quickly from a lot of water through there. Now, there's sometimes disagreements on was it one singular event or was it multiple rise, break events. Whatever the case is, they say the Columbia River Gorge, a big, basically canyon valley system, was formed catastrophically. Now, certainly there are other places around the world where that's, I'm sure has happened. Canyons in my backyard, it's been my main area of focus and study. But yeah, other canyons we believe have happened from big bodies of water spilling, big scale to even small scale. And then some canyons we do believe were formed in recession. As the flood was receding off the continents, perhaps we had some places where water channelized and carved the carved canyons. Not necessarily the Grand Canyon, we believe, but other places where that could have happened. So you start to look at the landscape, and I think the more you start to study it, the more you see evidence of catastrophe and big bodies going through. I can't remember who it was. You guys were, Jimmy, you're telling me about somebody who was doing research in northeastern Colorado here. Things I heard about that similar sort of thing. So I'm very curious about information to start to research too, because it's a great state here, right? And it's right in your backyard. So
in our backyard, you've got South Park, and you got 11 Mile Reservoir there, and then you got the canyon where that whole area of South Park drains through that canyon. Just to give a local example.
Nice. That's a great local example. 11 Miles South Park.
Yep. San Juan too is the same thing. Other than money, what are the qualifications that you look for people to go with you on your Grand Canyon trips?
Not a lot of qualifications. We've had people on river trips.
Just money?
See, our trips, they do tend to sell out about a year and a half to 2 years in advance, and so getting your name in pretty early is one of the things we kind of need to happen. But the trips that we take to the Grand Canyon, we use other companies that provide the rafts and things like that, so they're great companies to work with. Our rafts are about 37 feet long, 15 feet wide, and they're motorized on the back, so nobody has to wear out their arms rowing. And it's a pretty good, easy-going trip. We tend to say we take anyone 8 to 88. And we've had people actually on the very same trip that was as young as 8 and as old as 88 on the same trip. Most rafting trips we do with different levels. So we have a 4-day, a 7-day, and a 9-day rafting trip. And the 4-day doesn't have a lot of big major hike excursions. For those of you who are a little bit, hike and climb and do stuff like that, that's a great family trip. If you really are hiking and exploring and seeing some really good geology, big waterfalls, big features, river 7 or 9-day trip. But I've had people of all ages, of all skill sets. I've had people in their 60s who have never slept outside a night in their life. And it's the very first time at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. And it's spectacular because we sleep out cots to get us above the ground, but we don't have a lot of mosquitoes or anything to worry about at night. Sleeping bags and tarps and sheets and pillows and all that stuff. And you're laying out looking at the biggest array of stars you've ever seen in your life. And I've had people, again, in their 50s and 60s who have never even seen the Milky Way in their entire lives. And for the time they see the Milky Way from the Grand Canyon. It's amazing. So our average age, looking at the age range, our average age is right around 60 years old. People of all ages, of all physicalities, all kinds of stuff. We've had people on these river trips that have prosthetic limbs. We've had people, and if people want to do the really big hikes, we'll take you. If you don't want to do the big hike that day, well, there's a beautiful river to kick back and get your feet in and enjoy. So.
Where do you put in and where do you take out?
Upper river trip are 7 and 9-day river trips. They start at the beginning of the Grand Canyon at a place called Lee's Ferry. And so, if I can go back to this, Lee's Ferry is the beginning of the Grand Canyon. And so we're here, right there, Marble Canyon just above that. And we float down the river, we raft all the way down to about this point. That's 187 miles downstream on the 4 and 7-day trip, 7 and 9-day trips. And then we helicopter the Grand Canyon. Nobody has to hike out. That's great. We helicopter out of the Grand Canyon to the Bar 10 Ranch on the North Rim, and then we fly back from there. And then our 4-day trip starts at that place. We fly out to the Bar 10 Ranch. We have a whole day out there where we're skeet shooting and ATV rides out to the rim, horseback riding, big country western dinner, and a western show that night. Actually, it's the greatest western show for 80 miles. Guarantee it, because it's the only western show for 80 miles. And then the next morning, we helicopter to the bottom of the Grand Canyon. So, no hiking, hey! We helicopter to the bottom of the Grand Canyon. We have our days rafting along the river. Then the last day, about midday, we transfer to a high-speed jet boat, and you have about an hour-long jet boat ride into Lake Mead, onto a tour bus back to Las Vegas. So, whew, like 7 modes of transportation in 4 days that trip includes. And that does the lower 90 miles of the Grand Canyon. So we either start at the beginning, 187 miles later, helicopter out, or we helicopter in at that point and go the lower 90 miles to the very end of the Grand Canyon. Yeah. Big adventure. Big fun.
I have a question about the sediments that would be created from that quick erosion.
Yep.
And I've never really heard, it seemed like there would be large, kind of a unique set of deposits down in the Gulf of Cortez, I think, I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like there'd be a lot of relatively large chunks compared to a smaller erosion. Has
Yep.
any work been done I have never heard of any, but I was just curious about that.
Absolutely. So first of all, if the Colorado River carved the Grand Canyon over millions of years, like a giant conveyor belt, slowly removing sand grain by sand grain, all that material, roughly 900 to 1,000 cubic miles of dirt and debris, should be carried along that river, and it should be deposited at the end of that river in a big delta. Where the Colorado River enters the Sea of Cortez down there by Baja California, you should find a huge, massive delta, right? Big rivers make big deltas. Look at the Amazon River delta, the Mississippi River delta, the Nile River delta, that biblical land of Goshen, right? We find deltas where the moving water, like rivers, enters into slow-moving water like the seas and oceans. We should find a huge delta, roughly 1,000 cubic miles of material. But yet we don't. When you go down to the bottom of the Colorado River, there's only a teeny tiny delta. We are missing thousands of cubic miles of material. A tremendous amount of material is gone completely missing. What we should find, or what we do find, is that material is not found in the delta way down below. It's actually found further west of there, over the Mojave Desert and into the Anza Borrego Desert in Southern California, where the river doesn't go. And the condition in which we find that material is a bunch of broken gravels, broken and shattered, unconsolidated gravel fill, we call it. In fact, you walk out along the landscape, and I was out there last summer, walking along the areas that we see where we believe the water spilled out across this big, massive floodplain, and I'm finding pieces of rock. I'm like, this is a piece of Kaibab limestone. It doesn't belong here. It belongs way over there. You're finding all these broken pieces of rocks that are shattered and tumbled, and they're fractured, and they've just been basically dumped out across this massive, wide floodplain. Because as the Grand Canyon ends up stopping right about here, the Grand Wash Cliffs, all this water channelizing through, it's almost like a fireman's hose. You crank down that nozzle, and you can get a really sharp, hard cutting power, right? And that's what it's doing through the plateau. It's confined, it's restricted to the carving through this plateau. But at the end, where the plateau drops off and disappears, now it's the opposite. You crank the nozzle the other way, and that hose, that spray goes a big, far fan pattern, right? And that's what we see happening here. Carving, very direct, very constricted, and then it fans out and it dumps across this massive, big, open floodplain. Now, guys, what creates floodplains? Floods. It's in the name, right? So we see the deposit, the material, blanketing the landscape across a big, massive floodplain. And so that is indicative of an event, a flood, you might say, not a slow Colorado River. If the river and all the material should come out of here, it should go straight down to here, we should see it way down here. Yet we don't find it down here, we find it way out that direction. So the conditions we find it, it's still something I think that needs further research, and I think even in the creation community, we can have some really good research done on that by the creation community. But creation and secular have also recognized the problem of that. I was at a talk at the Grand Canyon a few years ago, and one of the titles of the talk, if I remember right, was something like, Grand Canyon, where's the dirt? You know, kind of like the old Wendy's commercial, where's the beef? Well, the question was, where'd all the sediment go? We're trying to find where all the sediment is, and why don't we find it where we expect to find it? Even in the secular community, they're trying to piece together where the sediment is and why we don't find it where we expect to find it, and the process is because it's a recognized problem in the current models. And so I think, hey, a singular flood event, a floodplain, a massive dumping, to me makes a lot more sense. Great question. Again, thank you guys very much. I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, thank you, Nate. That was great. Okay, so I just have a few announcements for you tonight. This is probably the most important of the announcements, and that is that Saturday, Nate is going to be doing a biblical tour of the Denver Museum of Nature and Science from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. So that's 5 hours of tour, if anyone's interested, and I'm sure it's going to be great. The cost is $15 for adults, $10 for students, and the key is that an adult must be accompanied by a student. So adults can't go by themselves. You have to have a student with you. There are still tickets left online, I believe, as far as we know. And I also have 4 tickets tonight that are available, too, if anyone would like them. Just see me after the meeting. But that's 10 to 3 Saturday at the Museum of Nature and Science. So if you can make that, I'm sure it'll be a wonderful tour.
And I would say, if anybody really wants to go and can't afford that price, let me know. Talk about it. We'll get you there. I'd rather people go in there and see it. The cost.
Great. Thank you, Nate.
And my email address is nate@canyonministries.org, so you can hold me that way.
Okay.
Tonight or tomorrow, say, hey, I'd like to go.
Okay. All right. And like I said, I have 4, which I'm going to give away after the meeting tonight. So see me if you'd like them. Okay, then just a quick note. Dr. Robert Brown is going to be at the Rocky Mountain Creation Fellowship next Friday night, December 9th. And his topic is the evidence in our solar system that supports the hydroplate theory. And for those of you that don't know Dr. Robert Brown, he's the son of Dr. Walt Brown, who came up with that theory. You may remember that we had Fred Williams here a few months ago, and he talked about the hydroplate theory. So this is Dr. Walt Brown's son, Dr. Robert Brown, to talk about that. And that's at December 9th, 7 o'clock p.m. At Littleton Baptist Church. And there's also a Zoom and live stream on that, too, if you can't get out to go. And then he's also going to be at the Pikes Peak Creation Fellowship on the following Saturday. So Friday night at Rocky Mountain, and then Saturday, December 10th in Colorado Springs at Faith Evangelical Free Church. Okay? So, and then just a reminder, we've got books, DVDs, etc. out here. There are a couple on the Grand Canyon, if you're interested. So please take a look at those. Christmas is coming up. They make great gifts, right? So, also we have our mailing list sign up there, and literature that you can take with you, pass out to your friends, see if we can increase our attendance here at these meetings. We also are a 501c3, so we accept donations any way we can get them. You can do it by going to our website or by mail, or there's a donation box out in the foyer. Okay, so we're going to close tonight with the Lord's Prayer, and then we'll sing I sing the mighty power of God. So let's pray. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.